Darkcast Network. Out of the shadows comes the best of indie podcasts. In 1897, Zona Heaster Shue died of what was initially ruled as natural causes. But then her mother, Mary Jane Heaster, was visited by the spirit of Zona, who revealed to her the true cause of her death. This is the only known case in which testimony from the dead helped convict a murderer. I'm your host, DJ, and this is the Mythical True Crime Podcast. In October 1896, Elva Zona Heaster, who went by the middle name Zona, met with blacksmith named Erasmus Stribling Trout Shue. Despite his previous marriages to two women, both of whom which died suddenly, young Miss Heaster fell madly in love with Shue, and after a brief courtship, she and he were married. Their little home seemed complete with happiness. No one would ever suspect it was to end in tragedy. During the first days of January 1897, Miss Shue fell ill. For several weeks, she was under the care of Dr. J. M. Knapp. Shue appeared very attentive to his bride's needs. On January 23, 1897, Zona was found dead in her home. The cause of death was listed as childbirth. The next morning, Mrs. Shue's body, accompanied by her husband and several neighbors, was taken over the mountain to Zona's mother's, Mary Jane Heaster, family home, where she was buried in the little family graveyard high up on the side of the mountain. Shue never once left his dead wife's side in the presence of others. When not at the coffin, he permitted no one else go near it, not even the mother. Several days after the funeral, Mary Jane Heaster was awakened from her sleep by a noise coming from a little cabin room. Peering into the darkness inside, where she could make out someone, it was her daughter, dressed in the very dress which she died in. The young girl seemed about to speak, but when her mother reached out with her hand, the girl disappeared. The next night, Miss Heaster resumed her prayers, and once more they were answered. Mrs. Shue talked more freely this time. A third visit was followed by a fourth, before the murdered woman told her mother the entire circumstances surrounding her death. Armed with the story allegedly told to her by the ghost, Mary Jane Heaster visited the local prosecutor, John Alfred Preston, and spent several hours in his office convincing him to reopen the matter of her daughter's death. Whether he believed her story of a ghost is unknown, but he did not have enough doubt to dispatch deputies to re-interview several people of interest inside this case, including Dr. Knapp. He was likely responding to public sentiment, as numerous locals had begun suggesting that Zona had been murdered. Preston himself went to speak to Dr. Knapp, who stated that he had not made a complete examination of the body. This was enough justification for an autopsy, and an exhumation was ordered. Zona's body was examined on February 22, 1897, in a local one-room schoolhouse. The autopsy lasted 3 hours, and it was found that Zona's neck had been broken. According to the report published on March 9, 1897, the discovery was made that the neck was broken and the windpipe mashed. On the throat there were marks of fingers, indicating that she had been choked, and the neck was dislocated between the first and second vertebrae. The ligaments were torn and ruptured. The windpipe had been crushed to the point in the front of the neck. It was indeed true that Shue had acted most strange throughout the period immediately following his wife's death and preceding her burial. He never left the head of his wife's coffin in the presence of mourning relatives and visiting neighbors. When the doctor rushed to the house the day Miss Shue had been found dead, Shue was there already holding her lifeless body. Not once during the physician's cursory examination did he relinquish Mrs. Shue's head, holding it close to his chest while he cried in anguish and prayed that a spark of life might be resurrected in her stiffened cold body. Shue was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of his wife, and placed in county jail without bond to await the June term of the Greenbrier County Circuit Court for trial before Judge J.M. McWhortle. Prosecuting attorney Preston and his assistant Henry Gilmer spent several months seeking additional evidence against Shue, both fearing the testimony of Mrs. Heaster that would not convict the prisoner. In the meantime, Shue obtained Dr. William Rucker and James P.D. Gardner to defend him. The trial officially began June 22, 1897. Within an hour, the trial was on. In his opening argument, Attorney Preston told the jury that the state's case against Shue was entirely circumstantial, but that the evidence was such that had never been presented in any court before. He laid stress upon the fact that the dream testimony that was presented would prove beyond doubt to be authentic, and informed the jurors that he could prove it. Dr. Knapp was the first witness called. He told of conducting the post-mortem examination and finding Mrs. Shue's death had resulted from a broken neck, dislocated so perfectly that it escaped his observation for 3 days. At the same time, the physician pointed out that the break was such of nature that it could not have been done by Mrs. Shue in a suicide attempt. Other witnesses stated that Mr. Shue had been the only person seen or been known to have been seen in and around the house that morning prior to the time that his wife had been found dead. Others told that he assisted in dressing Mrs. Shue, and in doing so placed a high, stiff collar around her neck. He then added a large veil, several times folded, and tied it in a large bow under the chin around the collar. Still other witnesses relate how the victim's head had appeared to be very loose around the neck, and when not supported, dropped from side to side. Others testified that his conversation and conduct after Mrs. Shue's death, the defendant failed to show proper appreciation for the loss. All of this testimony was leading up to the expected dramatic appearance of Mrs. Heaster. The entire conversation between Mr. Preston and Mary Jane Heaster is well documented as it was scribed in the court of law. In basic terms, he confined his questioning to the known facts of the case, skirting the issue of her ghostly sightings. Perhaps hoping to prove her unreliable, Mr. Shue's lawyers questioned Miss Heaster extensively about her daughter's visits on cross-examination. The tactic backfired, however, when Mrs. Heaster would not waver to the account, despite intense badgering. As the defense had introduced the issue, the judge found it difficult to instruct the jury to disregard the story of a ghost, and many people in the community still believe it. Consequently, Mr. Shue was found guilty of first-degree murder on July 11th and sentenced to life in prison. However, the Greenbrier ghost was never mentioned by the prosecution and played no part in the case against Shue. The 12-man jury and many spectators in the courtroom did not see eye to eye in regards to a proper verdict. A lynch mob was formed to take him from the jail to hang him in the streets. But the mob was disbanded by the deputy sheriff before any damage was done. 4 of the mob's organizers later faced charges for their actions. 2 days passed before Mr. Shue was moved from the Moundsville Penitentiary to serve the remainder of his life in prison. Erasmus Shue died March 13, 1900, in West Virginia State Penitentiary in Moundsville, the victim of an unknown epidemic. He was buried in an unmarked grave at the local cemetery. The state of West Virginia has erected a state historical marker near the cemetery in which Zona Shue was buried. It reads, "Interred from nearby cemetery is Zona Heaster Shue. Her death in 1897 was presumed natural until her spirit appeared to her mother to describe how she was killed by her husband. Autopsy on the exhumed body verified the apparition's account. Erasmus, found guilty of murder, was sentenced to state prison. only known case in which testimony from a ghost helped convict a murderer. I do hope you enjoyed tonight's story. As always, I'm DJ, and this was the Mythical True Crime Podcast. Links to all case files and information are found in the show notes below, and if you'd like to support this show, I do have my Patreon link there as well. I greatly appreciate you all listening, and I'm working to make this show better with new intros and hopefully work on some sponsorship to bring you even more mythical true crime content. And that concludes another captivating episode, delving into the world of mythical true crime. I appreciate you joining me tonight as we listen to the facts from these true crime tales. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll uncover even more mysteries. Until then, thank you for listening to tonight's episode. Good night.